Hey English II readers, Lambert here. Today we're talking about the next 4 vocabulary words from our introductory unit. We're talking about rhetoric, schema, lens, and analysis. Now, the first piece to understand is that rhetoric comes from the culture of ancient Greece. Rhetoric literally means to be skilled as a public speaker. Rhetors were considered to be rock stars in their culture, and they were just people who spoke regularly in a public forum. People who looked a lot like this guy right here, Aristotle. So in the culture of the ancient world, as you can imagine, they didn't have all the forms of entertainment that we're accustomed to. So they had to develop things that would be interesting and engaging and entertaining in some way. And one of the most popular sports of the ancient culture was to gather in a large public arena someplace downtown just outside the marketplace, and they would listen to philosophers explain and wax poetically about their most profound ideas. They were the rhetors, the public speakers. And they were considered to be very skilled at what they did if they could get some kind of emotional response from the audience. It wasn't just a matter of being able to persuade the listeners. They were considered to be very good at the practice of public speaking if they could get the crowd to laugh, for instance, or they were considered to be the best of the best if they could make the audience break down into tears and cry. And so when we talk about rhetoric, it comes from this ancient practice of being a public speaker. In our culture, we have many, many different ways to transmit the messages that we want to deliver to the world. There is, of course, public speaking. It's not as popular as it used to be. There's writing, there are visual arts and multimedia presentations. Most of the time in English class, when we're talking about the use of rhetoric, we mean to use the tools of rhetoric for writing, but primarily, we mean to use the tools and techniques of rhetoric for our practice in reading. I love this definition that we use in my class to understand rhetoric. I don't know who A.I. Richards is, or I.A. Richards rather, but I love what he says about rhetoric nonetheless. Rhetoric is the study of misunderstandings and their remedies. So one of the things that we like to point out is nearly everything that we encounter in the world is a text. When you walk into the mall in the morning, that is a living, breathing text. When you walk down the hall in transition between classes, that's a text. If you're a football player, a play called in the huddle, and then the play run at the snap of the ball, that is a living, moving, breathing text. And in all of these situations, and in many others, you can understand that there are multiple meanings being thrown at you all of the time, and there is plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding. And the ability, the tools, and the tricks of rhetoric allow us to swim through those misunderstandings, keep from drowning in them, and rhetoric allows us to interpret those multiple meanings very capably. So with that understanding of rhetoric, let's move to the first piece of rhetoric, and that is schema. Schema is any generalization developed by a reader or a writer to read the complex texts of the world all around them. And we all have schema. We all live by these generalizations. They're ways of understanding the world and making sense of the world around us. So here's a schema that I keep posted in my room all the time. This, or school, is a gym, not a jail. There are 2 competing schema comprised in that little slogan. One way you could think about school is that it's designed for punishment. It's very jail-like. The other way you could think about school or understand school is that it's a place to be pushed, not punished. You're to be trained and made to sweat and strain. It's a place to be improved personally, morally, intellectually. So in that example, we've got two very different schema, but both of them need to be considered and questioned and examined. Now, the thing to remember about schema when you're reading a complex text is that the author has a schema. The author is working by a generalization or a set of generalizations, and you have your own generalizations by which you understand the subject that the author is writing about. Now, in the case where your schema doesn't match the author's schema is the most important. You have to follow the author's schema at least for as long as you're in that particular text. At the end of the text, you don't have to agree with the author by any means. You could hold on to your schema, but at least for the time that you are reading and interpreting the text, you should follow the author's schema. Very important, and it's a mistake that 10th graders make without realizing it. How do you become more aware of your own schema as you're reading an author's stated schema? Well, your schema can be discovered simply by asking, do I agree with what the author is saying, or do I disagree with what the author is saying? The way you answer that question should reveal to you what your generalizations about that particular subject happen to be. That's schema. Make sure you're following the author's schema at least for as long as you are in a particular text. Then we move to lens, and up here on the big board we've got this pair of solar eclipse glasses that I wore a couple of weeks ago. What I love about this as a symbol and an illustration of what we mean by setting a lens in order to read a text is these glasses have such a thick, dark film as their lenses that they don't allow you to see anything at all when you put them on. In fact, they block everything out, and the only thing you can see through these lenses is the outline, the silhouette of the sun itself. So by wearing these glasses during the eclipse, I could see the outline of the sun and the silhouette of the moon moving in front of it more and more and more until it was nearly entirely blocked out. And that's one way for us to think about setting a lens in reading. It blocks all of the distracting ways we might look at a particular text, and a lens allows us only to see the text from one particular angle or in one specific way. When we talk about setting a lens in order to read a text, we mean looking at a text in a specific way that brings that text into sharper focus or deeper clarity. And there are many, many different lenses you can set in order to read a text. For example, if we go back to this text of school, you might read that text of school like a prisoner, like a student, an unsuccessful student, a resentful student who doesn't want to be in school. Or you might read that text with the lens of a teacher, an educator, an instructor, or a very successful and ambitious and academically minded student. There are a number of lenses that you could set in order to read any given text. So just be aware that you bring your own view to the text as you begin reading it. From lens, we go to analysis, and analysis is the method by which we break down a complex text into its parts. Remember, a complex text is any text that needs more than one step in order to understand it and to draw meaning from it. The work of analysis is not only breaking that complex text down into its parts, but then you examine each of those parts to see how it works. You consider how those parts work together. And then you put them back together, you reassemble them, and you look to draw a whole meaning out of that complex text. And we talk about a couple of different tools that we use for analysis in English 2, and one of our most used tools is the text wheel. It's simply a way to break the text down into its different pieces and to look at them each individually before we reassemble them together and draw out its whole meaning. And then there's the method of visualization. One of the ways that we can break down a very abstract and theoretical text is to draw it out. If you're struggling with a simile or a metaphor, for example, a very valid way of understanding that abstract concept is to visualize it, to draw it. Now, I love the use of these rhetorical tools and techniques as we begin our study of reading literature and interpreting literature because they do a couple of very important things for us. By using the tools and tricks of rhetoric, it changes our disposition as readers. It changes our identities as readers. We move from being passive readers to being active readers. And I think that's very important because most 10th graders I meet tend to be very passive readers. They think, mistakenly by the way, this is a broken schema, they think that the work, the heavy lifting, is to be done by the text itself, by the author, and the reader is simply dragged through the text. You sit back and let the text do all the work. That's a devastating mistake, and you've got to shift your understanding so that you move from being a passive reader to being a very, very active reader. The tools of rhetoric allow you to become much more active. The second reason I love the fact that we begin our study of reading and interpreting literature by using the tools and techniques of rhetoric is because it shifts the power of balance. Again, most 10th grade readers that I know mistakenly believe that the author has more power in the text than they, the readers, have, and that's wrong. As soon as an author writes a text, delivers it into the world, the balance of power shifts. The reader gains control over that text. When I put a text down in front of you, when Mrs. or Mr. Rutkowski put a text down in front of you, the author doesn't have control of it anymore. You do. You now have the power to identify the author's schema. You have the power to identify your own schema and to revise your schema in that text if you so choose. You have the power and the right to decide which lens you want to use in order to read that text. And you could choose from thousands of possible lenses. You get to choose which tools of analysis you want to use to break that complex text down into its parts and derive a meaning from it. That is a crucial change in our understanding. That is a crucial revision of our schema. The author doesn't have more power in the text than the reader. The power shifts when you become a very active, skilled, and knowledgeable reader. So there you have it. Be active in your reading. Take charge in your reading. Good luck. Go to work.